All right, folks, traditional greeting. We are going to be going through, I used to call this the kitchen sink, where I went through a whole lot of stuff all at once. Now, I find this useful in order to be able to understand how all these graphs operate together. All right. Now, what we're going to start with is the graph that we had previously, which is the aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. All right. So this is the one where you have the downward sloping line, this upward sloping line, and then this crazy guy that went here. The labels are GDP, so real gross domestic product on the x-axis, price level on the y-axis. This downward sloping line is aggregate demand. The upward sloping one is short run aggregate supply. And the vertical one here is long run aggregate supply, which intersects at full employment output. All right. Now, remember when we talked about this is that you're looking at production decisions as well as buying decisions. When price levels are lower, all right, then the aggregate demand tends to be higher. I'm not going to go through all that stuff again. You can go back and watch the previous presentation. Remember that aggregate demand is equal to C plus IG plus G plus XN. So consumption plus business investment plus government spending plus net exports gets you aggregate demand. And then the short run aggregate supply is upward sloping. So let's talk about production decisions, right? As price levels go up, producers will produce more. Price levels go down, they produce less, right? And that's in the short run. In the long run, there is no relationship between output and price levels. In the long run, the economy will produce at this level of full employment output, whatever it is for that country. When the country is at full employment, they'll produce this level of GDP no matter what, right? So you can change the amount of money in circulation, you can change the price levels, but the economy wants to get back to this full employment, all right? Now, what happens, you remember that if we have a recession, aggregate demand tends to shift to the left, a decreased consumption. Ooh, we'll make that fancy looking. You wind up having a decrease in consumption. Call that one 82. The original one there is 81. Oh, that wound up being not what I expected. All right. So consumption goes down, business investment goes down, which means the aggregate demand decreases. It's going to shift to the left. When that happens, we wind up with a lower price levels than what we had before. So original price level went down, and output has fallen as well. Okay. So this is the situation we find ourselves in. Now, remember the classical economists say you don't need to do anything. Eventually, unemployment will get bad enough. Workers will accept lower wages as wage cost goes down. Producers will produce more, and then SRAS will shift to the right, and we'll get back to long-run equilibrium again. All right, but you remember that not everybody says this. If you're a Keynesian, you could do something right now. This is going to be where you want the government to spend money. Okay. Because if it is the case that aggregate demand is equal to C plus IG plus G, oh, almost looked right. Yeah, I'll just keep it that way. Plus XN. Oh, stop with the corrections. Plus XN, right? Consumption plus investment, business investment plus government spending plus net exports. In the recession, consumption goes down, investment goes down, aggregate demand goes down, shifts left. Well, what we're going to do is use government spending to correct it, right? This is expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, now fiscal policy is roughly the government using taxing and spending to influence the economy. And this is what we're going to do. We can use fiscal policy, and that's going to be the government using taxing and spending, where the government will spend more money and or tax less in order to get more spending taking place in the economy. Another thing that we can use is called monetary policy. Okay, monetary policy. Now, if you see the word monetary, you should be thinking, well, that has to do with money, and it does. Okay, monetary policy is the Federal Reserve using the money supply to manipulate the economy. So this is not done by the government. This is done by the Fed. And we're going to come back to the Fed at a later point in time. But the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. That makes it not a bank in the conventional sense. It's not like First Alliance Bank or Bank of America or anything like that. You aren't unable to deposit your money there. A central bank is a bank of banks. It's a bank for banks. It is the Bank of the United States government. All right, so the government puts tax money there. That's what it uses to pay money out of when the Treasury has to make payments. So the Federal Reserve also controls the money supply. The government does not control how much money is in circulation. That is done by the Fed. And the Fed is a relatively independent entity of the federal government. It is not owned by the government, it is not directly controlled by the government, and it is privately owned. Okay. So it controls the money supply, and you can use the money supply to influence how the economy is going to operate. And it will do this through monetary policy. And in order to understand what's happening here, what we need is a new graph. Hold on. Okay. And this graph here is the money market graph. Money market graph. And what it is showing is the relationship between the quantity of money in circulation and nominal interest rates. Okay, so that Q sub M there is the quantity of money in circulation, and that lowercase I is nominal interest rates. Remember, nominal interest rates is going to be whatever your interest rate is on a savings account or the interest rate on a loan that you've taken out. It's not the real interest rate where we take inflation into account. It's simply the number of dollars you get for saving money or that you want to pay back for a loan. So nominal interest rate. This is important because some of our other graphs that we're going to look at are using real interest rate. This one, however, is nominal, which we represent with lowercase I. Okay. Now this is just a supply and demand graph. Just like we have supply and demand graphs, normally this is supply and demand, but in this case it is money. And this downward sloping curve is the money demand curve. Now, with a supply and demand graph, what we're contrasting is the price and quantity for a couple of products or for a product, right? So this is the demand, this is the supply. This money market graph is really the exact same thing, but what we're talking about is money. So we got the quantity of money down here at the bottom. Well, this lowercase I, the nominal interest rate, that is the price of money. And what we're thinking of here is what is the price for holding on to money? And so, therefore, how much money will the economy demand? This seems odd, but the economy only demands so much money at one time. Because we'll look at this, but money has three main functions. The first one is to be able to buy and sell stuff. The second is that we value things in terms of money. And the third is that we use money to store value. Well, when it comes to that first one, which is the big one, which is going to be we use money to buy and sell stuff, well, when interest rates are lower, right, interest rates go down, the quantity demanded for money is going to increase. The reason being is that at lower interest rates, what do people want to do? Spend their money or save their money? Well, the answer is spend it. If interest rates are lower, you're not going to get as much money by holding it, by saving it. All right. so therefore you're more likely to spend it. Really, the opportunity cost of spending money is lower because you're not giving up as much money that you could have gotten when you were saving. So when interest rates are lower, the quantity demanded of money is increasing. So this is why we have this downward sloping aggregate demand or money demand curve, right? And then when interest rates are higher, we go the other direction, right? When interest rates are higher, the quantity of money demanded in the economy is lower because instead of people spending money in the economy, now they're more likely to save their money, right, at those higher interest rates. There's a bigger opportunity cost now for spending money, which is you give up even more that you could have gotten by saving it. All right. You can also look at it from a borrowing perspective, right? If interest rates are lower, it's easier to borrow money, so therefore people are more likely to borrow, and if they're more likely to borrow, they're more likely to spend it, right? Whereas when interest rates are higher, it's more difficult to spend money. It's more expensive to borrow money. If it's more expensive to borrow money, you're less likely to borrow it, which means less money will get spent, right? So we have this inverse relationship between the demand for money, right? When interest rates are higher, the quantity demand for money is lower. When interest rates are lower, quantity demand for money is higher. All right. So that's the money demand curve. We also have a money supply curve, and that is a straight up vertical line. Now, why is it a vertical line? That's because there's only so much money in circulation at any one time. The money supply is only so big, and the Federal Reserve has monopoly control over it. It's not like a conventional product over here, right? With in a market where you could have multiple suppliers being influenced by price, right? The Fed's not being influenced by interest rates, and instead the Fed is the one influencing the interest rates. All right. So what we have here is let's say that we are in our recession. Okay, so we're in this recession scenario over here. Go away. We're in this recession scenario. Price levels have gone down. All right. Output has decreased. Also, we're not making as much stuff as what we used to be. The government can come along and use its fiscal policy, right? It can spend more money as well as tax less, expansionary fiscal policy. But the Federal Reserve can get into this action also, and it can do expansionary monetary policy. And expansionary monetary policy is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It will expand the money supply. Now, if it expands the money supply, what that means is the money supply curve, this guy here, is going to shift to the right. And it's just a vertical line, so it's going to go out here. So this is our first line. This is going to be our second one. All right. So we've increased the money supply. What happened when we increased the money supply? Here's where interest rates were. And here's where they are now. Interest rates dropped. All right. So by enlarging the money supply, the Federal Reserve has lowered interest rates. Okay. And what happens when interest rates are lower? Spending increases. Remember, at lower interest rates, people don't make as much by saving their money, so therefore they're more likely to spend. It is also cheaper to borrow money at lower interest rates, and when people borrow that money, they're going off and spending it, right? So it'd be like, let's say that I was making 10% on my savings, but now I'm only making 3%. Well, I'm less likely to save my money now because I'm not getting as much for it. So I'm going to spend money instead of saving it. Okay, and other way around, let's say that before it cost me 10% to take out a car loan, but now it's going to cost me only 3% when I take out a car loan. Well, I'm a lot more likely to take out that loan now at the lower interest rate, which means I'm more likely to buy a car. So consumption goes up, right? So from a consumer perspective, lower interest rates, again, means that people are more likely to spend money instead of save it. It's going to be the same case with businesses also. When they're doing investment in capital, it's easier for them to borrow money. And it's going to be the case that a business is just like an individual. They can save their money or spend it, which for the business is investment, right? So I know this sounds weird, but a business can save it or invest, right? Remember, investment for a business is investing in capital. They're going to buy copy machines, computers, machinery, and whatnot. So at the lower interest rate, the the business is going to make a bigger return off investing the money, building the factory, than what they could have by saving it. Okay, so lower interest rates means that businesses will also invest more. It's not just consumers who will spend more, it's also going to be businesses. All right, end result, what we wind up having here, that was the beginning quantity, this is the new one. The Fed increases the money supply, which means consumption goes up. So over here, consumption is going to go up, business investment will go up, which means aggregate demand will go up. Consumption goes up, business investment goes up. Doesn't have an effect on government. All right, government will spend whatever it wants when it wants. But the expansionary monetary policy will increase consumption, increase investment, which will then result in increasing aggregate demand. And when we do that, that means the aggregate demand curve will shift back to the right where it originally was. It'll go back to this position. So we'll get back to long-run equilibrium again through the Federal Reserve's actions of expansionary monetary policy. Okay. So if we come back here, we got expansionary monetary policy. Expansionary, which is when the Fed increases the money supply. And at a later point in time, we'll come back and we'll figure out how it increases the money supply. It's got a way of doing it, actually. It's got three ways of doing it. Okay, but expansionary monetary policy, the money supply increases. All right. Now, you might remember that we could have an opposite scenario. Let's say that aggregate demand shifts out here. So what we have now is price levels are terrible dots. Dot, 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 dot. So price levels are going up in this case. We're getting inflation. This is demand pull inflation. Okay, because demand is increasing, it's pushing prices upwards, at least in the short term. Output is increased also. We're making more stuff. But remember, we can't stay here for long because we're getting inflationary pressures. Classical economists say do nothing. Eventually, SRAS will shift back to the left and we'll get back at long-run equilibrium up here. If you're a Keynesian, you say, let's do something now. They see it as being a spending problem. If people are spending too much, we need people to spend less. So this is where the government can do expand contractionary fiscal policy, or the Fed can come along and do contractionary monetary policy. So we'll do the opposite of what happened up here. So we get quantity of money, lowercase I, demand for money, and money supply. Okay, so if it's doing contractionary monetary policy, again, what it sounds like, it's going to contract the money supply, which means less money in circulation. So the money supply curve will shift to the left. And what happens? Well, this is where we were, and this is where we wind up. So interest rates rose. Okay. And again, what happens when interest rates rise? At higher interest rates, people are less likely to spend money and they're more likely to save it. They're less likely to borrow money and more likely to spend it because they're not borrowing as much. And then on the business side, businesses are more likely to save their money instead of investing it in capital. And it's more difficult for them to take out loans as well. So the result is going to be that when we reduce the money supply, interest rates rise, and higher interest rates means less spending. So consumption would go down. Investment would go down, and aggregate demand would go down. So if we were to go back over here, our aggregate demand curve that is out here, where we're getting this nasty inflation, okay, the contractionary monetary policy would get aggregate demand to shift back to the left, and we get back to long-run equilibrium again. Okay, so this is contractionary monetary policy. Contractionary monetary policy, decrease the money supply. Okay, so you can do fiscal policy, which is going to be the federal government using taxing and spending to influence the economy. We can also have monetary policy, which is where the Federal Reserve, not the government, but the central bank, the Federal Reserve, will use the money supply to influence the economy. Because when you manipulate the money supply, you can manipulate interest rates. Okay? Where you can raise them or lower them, which will affect spending within the economy. All right. Now, that's monetary policy. Why is the monetary policy effective, though? Why is it? Why does it affect interest rates? Well, there's a reason for this. It has to do with a new graph we got, and this one is called the loanable funds graph. Loanable funds. Now, loanable funds is really what it sounds like. This is a supply and demand graph. Again, it's another supply and demand graph. And what we're talking about is the supply and demand of loanable funds within the economy. Think of this as being the money that you put into the bank, right? Where does a bank make money from? A bank is a business, it's there to make a profit. How is it going to make a profit? Well, it does it by loaning money out. And where does it get the money that it loans out? It gets it from you, the depositor. If you put $1,000 into the bank's not going to make a profit off of it just by holding on to it and being a good guy. No, no, no. The bank takes that money that is on deposit at the bank and then loans it out at interest. So it's making a profit off that interest, and maybe you get a little bit of cut of the action, right, through a savings account. And this is where the money is made for the bank, among other places, but this is one of the big places. A bank is what we call a financial intermediary. It is the connection between savers and borrowers. You want to save your money and you want your money to make more money. So you might do that by loaning it out, but gosh, it's going to be difficult to find somebody to loan to who's going to be trustworthy and all that. All right. At the same time, there are other people who want to borrow money and they want to find somebody to borrow it from who will be trustworthy and not break their kneecaps and charge reasonable interest rates. Well, if you don't have a bank, you just have to go around and try to find people. With the presence of a bank, the bank becomes that connection between the savers and the borrowers. You deposit your money in the bank will turn around and loan it out. And when it is loaning out that money, it is loaning it out at an interest rate. Okay. And the interest rate is really the price of the loan. How much is it going to cost? If I'm the borrower, how much is it going to cost me to take out that loan? Okay. The interest rate, the real interest rate in this case, for me is the price of that loan. All right. And for the bank's perspective, the bank is the one supplying the loanable funds. And so they are the ones who are being the producers, so to speak. And the price is how much they're going to make off of it. So in the loanable funds graph, what we have, the y-axis is the quantity of loanable funds, how much money is in the banks to be loaned out. And then the y-axis is lowercase r. Okay, that's a lowercase r, which is real interest rates. All right, not nominal this time, real. I want to stress that because you have to recreate this graph, which you may very well have to when you take the AP test. You got to make sure you have your notation correct. If you put an I here, you could wind up losing a point on an F or a Q simply because you had an I instead of an R. All right. The lots of times on the FRQs, they'll give you a point just for drawing the graph correctly and having everything correctly labeled. So even if you don't know anything else to do with the graph, if you can at least put the right notation on there and the right labels, you can still wind up coming away with something. All right. So we have the quantity of loanable funds, real interest rate, and then after that, it's just a supply and demand graph. Nothing fancy. This is the demand for loanable funds, and this is the supply for loanable funds. Right? In the past, I've had like LF there. I suppose you can do that if you want to. I've done that plenty of times in the past, but I don't want to complicate things too much. All right, but this is the supply and demand of loanable funds. Who's the supply of loanable funds? For the most part, savings. You save your money in the bank. Savings, for the most part, is the supply of loanable funds. Right? I don't want to say it's the only thing, but it's a big thing. Right? Supply of loanable funds mostly equals savings. All right, and the demand for loanable funds mostly equals borrowing. Okay, you put your money into the bank, you're creating the supply of loanable funds. You save it, that's the supply of loanable funds within the bank. That's the money there to be loaned out. Okay, and then other people want to borrow that money. They're demanding the loanable funds for their own purposes. And so the borrowing is the demand for loanable funds. Okay, now, what this means is that, well, if there's more savings in the economy, that could increase the supply of savings, which would therefore lower interest rates, right? Or if there's a bigger demand for borrowing in the economy, people are trying to buy lots of cars, I guess. The demand for loanable funds could shift to the right, in which case interest rates would rise. All right. Now, what's happening here when the Federal Reserve is enlarging the money supply is that savings increases in the economy. This is partly due to the method by which the Fed enlarged the money supply, which I'm not going to get into at this point. A lot of that money will wind up at banks to eventually be loaned out and distributed. Another aspect is because there's more money out there, people are going to be have more money to spend and save. Right, they'll be doing some of both. Right, but the Federal Reserve increase in the money supply will result in there being more savings. When the Fed enlarges the money supply, they do it through buying and through the purchasing of bonds that are owned by banks, government bonds that are owned by banks. So they replace the bonds with money that just came from nowhere, and the supply of loanable funds increases. That was not well done. That was slightly more or less well done. So the supply of loanable funds increases, and interest rates go down. The reason the interest rates go down when the supply of loanable funds increases, shifts to the right, is from the bank's perspective. If there's more loanable funds building up in the bank, having that money sitting around, not getting borrowed, is not doing the bank any good. So it'd be just like a business. Let's say a business is selling Dr. Pepper and they've got a lot of Dr. Pepper building up on the shelves, not getting sold. What are they going to do? They're going to lower the price on the Dr. Pepper to get people to buy it. Same thing here is happening with the loanable funds. All right. If the supply of loanable funds is increasing, there's more money being deposited at the bank, which means there's more money available to be loaned out, but nobody's borrowing it at the current price. What's the bank going to do? The bank will start to lower interest rates to make it more attractive to borrow the money. And at lower interest rates, the quantity demanded for those loanable funds will increase. Right? At lower interest rates, people will be more likely to borrow the money. All right. So this is why when the Fed engages in expansionary monetary policy, increases the money supply, more loanable funds build up at the banks, which therefore banks lower their interest rates, and this is where you see the lower interest rates happening in the money market graph, right? Interest rates go down, therefore spending increases, and you're trying to get more consumption and investment. All right, so this is the relationship here between the loanable funds graph and the money market graph, right? And conversely, if the Fed was doing contractionary monetary policy, they will reduce the money supply, less money in circulation, and selling bonds this time to the banks, which reduces the amount of money at the banks, means that there will be a lower supply of savings, in which case interest rates rise. Right? Because if there's less money available to be loaned out, the banks realize they can charge a higher premium, a higher price for the lower amount of available money that is there to be loaned out. So they'll charge higher interest rates, right? And higher interest rates means less spending, more savings, right? this makes sense. I'm hoping so. All right. So this is the loanable funds graph. All right. I'm going to go through another graph here. This is called investment demand. Investment demand graph is super easy. And it looks like this. That's it. All right. So you got lowercase r, real interest rate right there. You have quantity of investment. Remember, investment is businesses investing in capital, and a downward sloping investment demand curve. All right. And so you might need to know this graph, or you might have to use it. There's not too many FRQs I can think of offhand that really talk about this, but there's not even a supply curve on it. The idea here is that interest rates go down, the quantity of investment demand increases because of what we've said before. If interest rates are lower, banks are less likely to save their money, more likely to invest in capital. And when interest rates are lower, they're also more likely to borrow money to therefore invest in capital. All right, lower interest rates means higher amount of investment. Right, higher interest rates means lower amount of investment demand. All right, so that's all you really need to know with that graph. Like I said, not terribly complicated. Okay. Last graph I'm going to go over here for the moment, and there's more stuff that we have to worry about, but it's going to be a graph called the Phillips curve. Phillips curve. So standard graph again. This one's a little bit of a different animal. This is showing the relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. Right, that pi there, it's not straight down pi, but that pi percent is the inflation rate. Okay, and then down here on the x-axis, you have the unemployment rate. Okay, now what happened is the guy named Phillips, I think it was A.W. Phillips, he was actually a New Zealand economist, and he started looking at New Zealand, and then later we saw the same sort of phenomenon happening in Great Britain and in the US. And what they found was that there was an inverse relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So this line, this downward sloping curve here, is called the Phillips curve. And what they found is that when the inflation rate was higher, the unemployment rate was lower. And when the inflation rate was lower, the unemployment rate was higher. That they moved in opposite directions. Okay. Now, the reason this became important from a policy perspective is that if you're a country or a policymaker, what you really want is both of these factors to be low. You want low inflation and lower unemployment. But what they discovered is that you can't really get as much of both as what you want.